Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I'm Jawad Ami and these are the headlines. Taliban's leader Sher Mohammad Stanekzai says no peace talks are planned with Afghan officials for early September. The statement comes hours after the chairman of the Afghan Council for Reconciliation, Abdullah said talks will begin next month. A major stumbling block has been the issue of release of the Taliban prisoners. In New Zealand, a far-right terrorist who murdered 51 worshippers in two Christchurch mosques has been sentenced to life in prison without parole. Brenton Tarrant is the first person in the country's history to get the sentence. Earlier, Tarrant pleaded guilty to the murder of 51 people, attempted murder of another 40, and one charge of terrorism. In Mali, coup leaders say they have released former President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta from detention. Keïta was arrested on gunpoint during the coup on the 18th of August. His release was one of the demands of Mali's international partners, including France and West Africa's regional bloc. Those are the headlines and detailed stories right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. Taliban's leader Sher Mohammad Stanekzai says no peace talks are planned with the Afghan officials for early September. The statement comes hours after the chairman of the Afghan Council for Reconciliation, Abdullah, said that talks will begin next month. The long-awaited peace talks are aimed at paving the way to end the decades-long war. A major stumbling block has been the issue of the release of the Taliban prisoners. Pakistan has been pushing both the sides to resolve differences and sit across the negotiating table. Pakistan says the international community must hold India accountable for its atrocities in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. At a weekly press briefing, Foreign Office spokesman Zahid Hafiz Chaudhry said Indian unilateral actions in the occupied valley is a clear violation of the international law and the UN Security Council resolutions. Speaking about India's rows serving terrorist commander Kulbhushan Jadhav, Chaudhry said India is trying to deliberately frustrate Pakistan's effective implementation on UN court's verdict. The occupied valley has been under India's curfew and communications blackout since August last year. Nearly 220 people have been martyred during military crackdowns since then. China has urged the US politicians to stop provocation, saying Beijing will not allow Washington to cause trouble. At a briefing, a Defense Ministry spokesman Wu Qian said certain US politicians are vainly trying to fuel military conflict. The ministry said it hopes Washington can take measures to create a positive atmosphere for high-level exchanges between their two militaries. Earlier, China's foreign ministry said Washington's sanctions on Chinese companies involved in construction in the South China Sea are unjust. Beijing's statement come after U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper said China's growing military spending indicates its global ambitions. Speaking in Hawaii, Esper said Washington is open to working with Beijing to align it with the international rules-based order. The US says scores of its soldiers were injured in northwestern Syria after a Russian military patrol slammed into their vehicle. In a statement, a White House spokesperson said US troops suffered concussion following the incident. The spokesperson said unprofessional actions breached the deconfliction protocols that the US and Russia are committed to. He said the coalition and the US do not seek escalation with any military forces, but he said the US forces retain the inherent right and obligation to defend themselves from hostile acts. Meanwhile, UN-backed talks on a new constitution for Syria will resume in Geneva following a break as some delegates tested positive for COVID-19. In a statement, UN envoy Geir Pedersen's office said the talks are aimed at rewriting the war-torn country's constitution. In Mali, coup leaders say they have released ousted President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta from detention. He was arrested on gunpoint during the coup on the 18th of August. His release is one of the demands of the Mali's international partners, including France and West Africa's regional bloc. On Wednesday, West African mediators told Mali's military coup leaders to form a transitional government for a maximum of 12 months. The military leaders said they want to stay in power for a 3-year transition period. Meanwhile, France's Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian said the French army will continue its operations against the militants in Mali. 75 people have been killed in an overnight attack by Boko Haram militants in Nigeria's northeastern town of Gawoza. A government official said the militants targeted the town's elderly people in the attack. He said people continue to die every day despite security forces are doing their utmost in the region. The official said the people of the region are facing extreme hunger and the situation will worsen if there is no aid for them. More than 50,000 civilians and security personnel have been killed by Boko Haram terrorists in over a decade. Turkey says it is not creating instability in the eastern Mediterranean. In a statement, a Turkish Communications Directorate said President Tayyip Erdogan made these remarks in a phone call with U.S. counterpart Donald Trump. The statement said the two leaders discussed bilateral and regional developments, particularly the Mediterranean. It said Erdogan stressed that Turkey proved with concrete actions that it wants to reduce tensions and establish a dialogue on the matter. Meanwhile, Trump has also discussed the matter with Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis in a separate phone call. The White House said Trump expressed concerns about rising regional tensions. Trump also urged both NATO allies to resolve the dispute through dialogue. Poland has summoned the Belarusian envoy after President Alexander Lukashenko accused Warsaw of plotting to seize part of the country. In a tweet, Poland's deputy foreign minister said the ambassador was summoned to protest over unfounded accusations by Lukashenko. Earlier, Belarus state media said Lukashenko accused Poland of planning to take over the Grodno region in the country if the country falls apart, rather. It reported that the president has dispatched some armed forces to the western border with Poland. Lukashenko is facing mass protests against his 26-year-old rule since August the 9th election. He denies accusations of electoral fraud and says the protests have been orchestrated and funded from abroad. Russian President Vladimir Putin says Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko has asked him to set up a reserve police force for him. Moscow's state media said Lukashenko told Putin he will use it only if the crisis gets out of control. But Putin said there is no need for now to use the Russian forces in Belarus. The Russian president said the situation in Belarus is normalizing. Putin also claimed a group of Russian mercenaries had been lured to Belarus by Ukrainian U.S. intelligence operation. Belarus has been rocked by weeks of protests against the August 9 presidential vote. Lukashenko has repeatedly accused NATO of massing forces around his country's western border, a claim which the alliance denies. Protests in the U.S. city of Kenosha in Wisconsin state continues for the fourth night following the shooting of Jacob Blake by a police officer. Demonstrators defied the 2-hour night curfew to hit the streets in eastern Kenosha County.
Violence has occurred throughout the last 3 nights, with buildings set on fire and 2 people killed yesterday. Court officials say a teenager identified as Kyle Rittenhouse has been arrested and charged with homicide. The lakeside city has been rocked by civil unrest, to which President Donald Trump says he is sending federal forces to restore order. In a tweet, Trump said the nation will not stand for looting, arson, violence and lawlessness on American streets. But local media says National Guards are not present in the city's east side where the protesters have gathered. Meanwhile, Wisconsin's Attorney General Josh Call has named the officer who shot Blake. Talking to media, Call said officers found a knife in Blake's car but no other weapons. The Department of Justice has sent over 200 FBI agents and U.S. Marshals to the city as it opens federal investigation into the shooting.
U.S. Vice President Mike Pence has promised to preserve law and order and economic viability on the third night of the Republican National Convention in Baltimore. Pence warned the Americans against electing Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden. Pence said, contrary to Biden's assertions, economic recovery and law and order were on the ballot, not democracy. He said Biden will do the bidding of the radical left and that the American identity was on the line in the elections. The vice president also slammed Biden over his proposal to reduce funding for the law enforcement, saying Biden's America will not be a safe place. He said U.S. President Donald Trump will always stand with the police against the rioters in Minneapolis, Portland, Kenosha, or anywhere else.
The violence must stop, whether in Minneapolis, Portland, or Kenosha. Too many heroes have died defending our freedom to see Americans strike each other down. We will have law and order on the streets of this country for every American of every race and creed and color.
President Trump will address the convention on the fourth and the final night of the Republican convention. And now moving on, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has met the Sultan of Oman, Haytham bin Tariq Al-Saud, during his Middle East tour. The meeting comes following a U.S. brokered deal on normalizing relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Pompeo said he discussed building regional peace, stability and prosperity throughout the region. Oman praised the U.S.-backed accord between the UAE and Israel. Earlier, Israel's intelligence minister said Bahrain and Oman can be the next Gulf Arab countries to formalize ties with Tel Aviv. Before arriving in Oman, Pompeo visited Jerusalem, Sudan, Bahrain and the UAE. Talks on the scope and scale of a 42-year-old UN peacekeeping mission in Lebanon are set to run all the way up to Friday's meeting. Its mandate will be renewed during the United Nations Security Council session on the 28th of August. Lebanese officials fear failure to renew the mandate could lead to an uncertain situation. The UN interim force in Lebanon has been stationed at the country's southern border since 1978. It was beefed up following the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah. For years, the U.S. has been pushing for changes to the mission's mandate that would decrease the number of troops. Human Rights Watch says Lebanese security forces used excessive force against anti-government protesters after the Beirut port explosion. In a statement, the international rights body has called for an investigation into the abuses. The explosion fueled outrage at the political class, already blamed for an economic meltdown. In demonstrations 4 days after the blast, some protesters stormed government ministries and hurled stones at the security forces. The rights group said security forces had fired live ammunition, metal pellets and projectiles such as rubber balls at health workers. It said police deployed excessive quantities of tear gas and security forces threw stones at protesters and beat them. It said such unlawful force against mostly peaceful protesters show the callous disregard of the authorities for their own people. Germany has called on Russia to help investigate Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny's suspected poisoning. Addressing media, German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas said Russia should join efforts to clear up what happened to Navalny. Maas said the EU foreign ministers will discuss the matter today in a meeting. He said without Russia's help, the bloc will have to decide how to proceed on its own. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson have also urged an independent probe into Navalny's incident. Earlier, Berlin's hospital treating Navalny indicated that he had been poisoned days after he was flown from Siberia. The EU's chief Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, has called for a deal with Britain on future ties by the end of October. Speaking in Paris, Barnier said a deal must be reached to ensure ratification of a new treaty. The EU negotiator said if conditions allow, he can meet his British counterpart next week. Talks between London and Brussels over post-Brexit ties have made little progress, with both the sides blaming each other for the stalemate. The post-Brexit transition period is expiring on the 31st of December. More stories to follow, but right after a short break. Welcome back. The new coronavirus has infected over 24 million people, claiming more than 826,000 lives across the globe. India has recorded its highest ever daily cases with over 75,000 infections, increasing the tally to over 3.3 million. Details in this report.
As the Americas continue to struggle with COVID-19, the virus has also tightened its grip over India, the country of over 1 billion people. While the country breaks the record of new cases every other day, India's death toll has exceeded the 60,000 mark with 1,023 fatalities overnight. In Latin America, Argentina has registered a record daily rise of more than 10,000 infections, while in Peru, healthcare employees protest over working conditions as the country's infection tally crossed 600,000. The U.S. state of California has announced to test 250,000 people for the virus every day.
California is committing to a diagnostic testing partnership that will provide an additional 150,000 tests per day. So we're averaging over 100,000 tests a day. We were doing well north of 130,000 before the wildfires. We'll get back up into that range very shortly. This is additive. It's not a substitute.
In Europe, Ukraine has banned most foreigners until September 28th and extended lockdown measures until the end of October. Germany has banned protests against coronavirus curbs as organizers failed to ensure protective measures would be observed. Whereas despite reporting a new post-lockdown high with cases topping 5,000, France prepares to restart school with mandatory masks.
What everyone must understand in a clear and simple way is that all adults must wear a mask, and children as teenagers must wear it from the first year of the middle school. It is true that in July-August, we thought to set up some exceptions as for assistance in preschool class, or when social distancing was respected for some activities, but we have chosen not to keep those exceptions in order to make the rules clear for everyone.
In Australia, the second most populous state of Victoria has reported its lowest number of daily cases in 2 months, as 113 tested positive overnight. Mainland China recorded only 8 new imported cases and no domestic transmissions. South Korea has recorded over 440 cases overnight, its highest number of daily infections since March.
In Pakistan, the number of active COVID-19 cases continue to fall under the 9,000 mark. The Health Ministry said the recovery rate from the disease is over 94%. The ministry said 445 new cases were reported across the country overnight, taking the toll to over 294,000. It says 6 more people died in the last 24 hours. The nationwide death toll stands at 6,274. Sindh remains the worst hit province, witnessing nearly 129,000 infections, while Punjab has reported over 96,000 cases so far. The toll from floods triggered by torrential rainfall in Afghanistan's 12 eastern provinces has risen to 150. The Ministry of Disaster Management said 147 people were injured and many others were missing since Tuesday night. The latest casualties come from Kapisa and Panjshir provinces. The ministry data said 1,500 houses and more than 1,000 hectares of agricultural land were destroyed in the floods. A ministry official said the search and rescue operations are underway in the flood-hit areas. A spokesman for President Ashraf Ghani said authorities have been instructed to provide emergency disaster relief to survivors. Hurricane Laura has made landfall near the American state of Texas and Louisiana as a Category 4 storm. The U.S. National Hurricane Center says the hurricane packed maximum sustained winds over 240 kilometers per hour. The NHC said the storm is currently located about 70 kilometers east of Port Arthur, Texas. The storm is now expected to move inland across southwest Louisiana. About 620,000 people were under mandatory evacuation orders in Louisiana and Texas, while 103,000 houses in the 2 states are without power. No casualties have been reported so far in the U.S., whereas at least 23 died in the storm in Haiti before it moved towards the Gulf of Mexico. It's time for a short break. We'll be back with more stories. Stay tuned. U.S. stocks have gained steam after the Federal Reserve unveiled a new framework that could keep interest rates lower from a longer period of time. All the three Wall Street indices are trading higher. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is trading higher by about 1%. The S&P 500 is trading higher by about 0.5%. The Nasdaq Composite Index is also trading marginally higher. Meanwhile, oil prices fell after Hurricane Laura made landfall in the heart of the U.S. oil industry, forcing oil rigs and refineries to shut down. The World Economic Forum says its yearly meeting in Davos has been postponed to the summer of next year. In a statement, the forum's spokesman, Adrian Monk, said the decision was taken following advice from health experts amid the pandemic. Monk said it was not an easy decision, since the need for the leaders to come together to design the Great Reset in post-pandemic era is so urgent. He said in lieu of the meeting, the forum will host virtual high-level discussions the week of January 25. The announcement came at the same day Swiss authorities recorded 383 COVID-19 infections in the last 24 hours. England batsman Jason Roy will miss the T20 series with Pakistan after sustaining a left side strain. The 30-year-old batsman was injured during training for the three-match series, which starts at Old Trafford tomorrow. He had a scan on Wednesday and will remain with England setup during his rehabilitation program. England will also face Australia in 3 T20 internationals, followed by 3 ODIs from the 4th to 16th of September. Roy has scored 9 ODI hundreds and 18 50s in 90 matches, as well as 5 50s in 35 T20 internationals. Another weather situation from around the globe. And that is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus.News.